like Doug was saying, identity is a huge component for driven women. A lot of the women that we work with are moms, and there's a big conflict in identity for driven women who are mothers, and being, feeling guilty while they're at work that they're not with their kids, and then feeling guilty while they're at home that they're not advancing. So my identity was very similar in that I was striving for results to prove that I'm good enough, to prove that women in general are just as strong as men, and not appreciating or valuing this entire landscape of femininity.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I've got a lot of experience with this because I've worked with many people that have this. Jung speaks of archetypal possession, a state in one that is fused into an archetypal drama, and so deeply in pursuit of the goal they're trying to achieve that they lose sight of everything else, and it often leads to living like somebody's possessed. I've worked with many elite triathletes, biathletes, ex-gamers, and I have to go through this kind of thing with them all the time. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on the difference between driven and being possessed from the Jungian perspective.
They often go hand in hand until they meet people like us. So it's, and I give a koan in my book that I worked on for 2 years before I actually came up with a sufficient answer. But it's when a driven is no longer identifying with their emotion, their shadow, their hurt feelings, and they're trying to identify with this basic narcissism. They're trying to identify with the results they've achieved. Going to, my opening comment about the dual PhD, I was hoping it would get rid of this hurt and this pain of feeling like a fucking moron. Didn't work. Meaning that even after the PhD is after my name, this inner experience I'm having didn't go away. And it's the 2 seconds after crossing and I've done Ironmans, it's 2 seconds after crossing the finish line of an Ironman, it feels amazing for 2 seconds, if that, until your head turns around and you look at the time. The moment you have a result that you can identify with, you're at risk of possession. And, the second commandment is have no idol before me. It's where you're idolizing a result and you believe that's going to change you as a fundamental person. I have been possessed, and I frequently have moments of possession where the results are so unbelievably important for me, I'm willing to do anything for them.
Yeah, it's a challenging situation, and it leads to a lot of problems. I've seen a lot of divorces come from it. And, the way I handle that is I sit down with people and I ask them, what is it that you need to survive and remain whole enough as a person to live your life fully? And almost always, some of the first things that are said is, well, my wife and kids or my family, or, they often don't even realize what they're saying. And I say, okay, now I want you to look at what you just said, and I want you to write it down. And then I want you to look at what's happening in your life and why you're having challenges with your wife, why you're often upset at yourself because you're not spending time with your kids, or why you're having challenges in relationships. And almost always they realize it's because they're avoiding the very thing that they know at a deeper level that they need the most to be a whole person. And oftentimes they don't realize that they couldn't be the person they are without the support of the people that they're avoiding. So then I, use my 4-doctor model and say, okay, what is happy making for you? Usually it's whatever they're possessed by. And then I say, okay, now we have to have values in order to keep you from being possessed, because when you possess, it means you're losing yourself. It means that you're not really there. Something else is there. And if you don't know what that something else is, you never know who you are. Therefore, you never know who's accomplishing or not accomplishing anything. And that's an endless trap. It leads to burnout. And if, as an athlete or anybody, if you lose your path or your career because you destroyed yourself, then you actually are in this very dangerous place of having disabled yourself and never knowing who you are. And now you are stuck as a broken person who can't have the freedom that they were ultimately trying to create in the first place. So it's kind of like a Mexican finger trap. The harder you pull, the harder it binds.
Yeah, that's a great description of a con. It is that bind that calls forth the drivens to really ask that important question that you've been trying to answer. Who am I? And because it can't be my feelings. I can't be the results of all my hard work. I can't be, so we wind up esoterically, with this big question mark. What I do in my book is answer it very simply. Is rather than who, it's a what. Mm-hmm. What am I? What I am is an animal. Can't deny that. No matter what you do, we can all agree that human beings are animals. And then on top of that, I am not my feelings. I am not my thoughts. I'm not the sensations of my body. I'm not just all of those other things. What am I? And your work, where you're calling forth people's soul identity. Who you really are is the one who wants the freedom. Who you really are is the one who wants this sense of righteousness. Who you really are is the one who wants this sense of balance and purpose. None of those things will come from behaviors or chasing that as an outcome. Because what you're going for is a state of being, not a thing you're doing.
I think part of the problem is an identity crisis, because most of the things that we do as driven people until we have a spiritual awakening is something to acknowledge that we are useful, capable, powerful, that we can be successful, that we can be loved by other people, wanted by others, needed by others, needed on a team, needed because you make money for doing what you're doing, needed because you're supporting other people through your drivenness. So the thing that I've found is that whenever there's an identity crisis, then the driven behavior continues until the identity crisis has healed itself. And when you realize that the things that you do are an expression of, like art is an expression of an artist, or music's an expression of a musician, but who you really are inside yourself is something much greater than any of those temporary tasks or accomplishments. And that really requires somebody that has the skill from having lived that path to guide somebody into it, or it just becomes a bunch of philosophical, academic gobbledygook.
Could not agree more, Meg. Megan, tell us your path from 2 years ago to today, how your identity has shifted.
Yeah. And I think that, like Doug was saying, identity is a huge component for driven women. A lot of the women that we work with are moms, and there's a big conflict in identity for driven women who are mothers, and being, feeling guilty while they're at work that they're not with their kids, and then feeling guilty while they're at home that they're not advancing. So my identity was very similar in that I was striving for results to prove that I'm good enough, to prove that women in general are just as strong as men, and not appreciating or valuing this entire landscape of femininity. And it all goes back to that wounding and feeling like you need to protect yourself, and you overdevelop a lot of these masculine traits and you undervalue, just like society currently undervalues a lot of feminine approach to things and feminine power. So my experience the last 2 years in working with Doug and training under Doug is really around understanding what's that innate part of me that's driven, that is looking over the horizon, or is a creative thinker, or a risk taker, and what part of me is that social scripted, striving to prove myself, and kind of trying to separate those two.
Well, what ultimately did it then?
Lots of crying on my yoga mat. That's my running joke with women, is I had to first understand that my view of the world is bias, and femininity is strong. There are good men, lots of them. And I had to understand that my experience with the world is not the world. It's not the reality. It was my reality up until that point. And becoming more open to that and understanding and just studying the shit out of masculine and feminine dynamics. And because you look for confirmation bias, you look for all the reasons that men are oppressing women, and you can find them if you're looking for them.
Yes.
So I had to go look for the things, and I've read, I have a pretty big bias against Christianity. So I've spent a lot of time the last 6 months reading Christian texts and trying to say, if I'm not right, and if there is value in this, if there are nuggets from God in this, how can I understand it differently so that I embody it, so that I believe it, so that I can see the good they are trying to do here?
Well, yeah, it's hard to do reading Christian text. You need to read a book like The Third Jesus by Deepak Chopra, or study Father Thomas Keating, or Meister. Matthew Fox is a very good place to go for that.
But I can notice in my body how even the language used triggers me.
Oh, yes.
So it's completely an exercise in understanding my unconscious bias.
Yeah, if you listen to my 4 podcasts with Anna Retort, author of Krivda, The God Tricks Against the Matrix, she addresses everything you're talking about with great intensity. And she's a woman, and she's a smart one, and she's got a lot to say that I think you'll find very interesting. In fact, her book's very hard to get. If you email me your shipping address, I will send you a copy of it.
I love that.
And she will read it by Tuesday. I mean, it's...
Yeah. Well...